everyone, myself Dr. M. Lakshmi Prasad, working as an associate professor in the Department of Data Science in Institute of Aeronautical Engineering, Hyderabad. In this video, I'm going to discuss about what are the various sources of the data collection. So data collection, so it should be very important before going to implement or any kind of application in order to become an data science and then data scientist like this. So data collection is very important. So when it comes to introduction of this topic, so the data can be able to define as the quantitative or qualitative values of the variable. So that means that it should be a number, or it may be images, or it may be words, figures, facts, or ideas, right? So the data can be defined as the quantitative or qualitative value of the variables, and it should be the lowest unit of information from which the other measurements and analysis can be done. And data should be treated as one of the most important and vital aspect of any research study, right? So the data can be defined as the quantitative, so where we can able to express the data in terms of values, and qualitative, where there should not be any kind of values for that variable, right? So of that variable. So example, suppose number have a value and images should comes under qualitative, and the word should comes under qualitative, and figure should also comes in qualitative, facts and ideas, and figure number should comes into this quantitative. So like this we can able to classify the data into different types like quantitative and qualitative, and this is the lowest unit of information from which the measurement analysis can be done, and the data should be considered as one of the most important one aspect of the research study. So, what are the factors to be considered for before collection of data? So, first one should be objective and scope of the inquiry should be very important for collecting the data, and the sources of information, where the information is coming, whether it may be a primary source or it may be a secondary source, we have to be identified. So it is also very important factor to be considered for collecting the data, and quantitative expression have to be considered, and what are the techniques that are available for data collecting. So there are so many techniques I have are available for collecting the data. So in previous video I discussed all the techniques what are available for collecting the data, and we have to be considered units of collection also, right? So if you look at this structure of this diagram, so first determine what should be the data requirements you have to be identified, and the sources of information you have to find, and then budget also you have to be linked out. So then first step we should be the what should be the sources of the data, where the data is going to be coming, whether it may be coming from primary source, or it may be coming from secondary source. Okay, so the data what is coming from primary source is nothing but that it should be the data that is directly connecting by conducting the interviews, and then experiments what we conducted directly, and gathering the information through telephone, personal interviews like that. So that and all will be considered as the primary source, and similarly the secondary source is the thing where you can able to get the data from the published one, like books, and then magazines, and then newspapers, like this. So this and all will be considered as the secondary source of the data, and then units of information also the data is very important, and then budget also going to be important. So once this data what we gather from the sources is identified, then that should be sent to the data collection design. So whatever the data we're collecting, so that should be represented in the form of dump design. So normally you can able to collect the data in the form of tables, I can able to represent, or I can able to represent the form of trees. So you have to be follow some specific design for the data. Then once the design is finished, then you have to make a data acquisition plan. So these are the things what we have to be considered for collecting the data. So first one should be the objective of the data, and scope of inquiry should be considered, And the sources of information also very important, so where the data is going to be coming, and then quantitative expression, so whether the data is going to be whether quantitative data or qualitative data we have to be considered. Okay. And so the techniques what we should be considered should also be considered for the data collection, and event of collection should also be there. So the sources of data should be classified into different types like external sources and internal sources. And again, these external sources will be classified into different types like primary data and then secondary data. So the sources of the data what we took, right? So it should be two types of sources, internal one and external one. So again, this internal means all the data which is defined in the system will be considered as the internal one, and external, so the data what I'm going to be collected from other sources should be treated as the uh, external sources. So here they should be considered as the primary and secondary again. So the data what we gathered from directly from the persons or interviews who have been conducted, so that should be considered as the primary one. And the data what we gathered from the books published ones, so like newspapers and then magazines like this, so then that should be considered as the secondary data. So let me explain the differences in detail about what is the internal and external sources of the data. So internal source means many of the institutions and departments have information about the regular functions for their own internal purpose, and similarly when the information is collected from outside agencies is called external source of the data. And when those information what we use in survey is called internal source of the data. So example like social welfare societies, and the data that is going to be either secondary or primary, you have to find out the based on that what type of information we collected by the census or the sampling method or by through conducting survey should be treated as the external source of the data, right? So the external, internal, and two the different ones. So the internal means already the existing data within the internal available one should be considered an internal source of the data. And the data what we gather from outside of the institutions or outside of the agencies, what we call it as the external source of the data. Then, so when those information what we use in any kind of survey is called the internal source, and the data what we gather from external, whether it may be again of two types like primary one and secondary one. An example of this internal source of data will be social welfare societies. So primary data. So what is primary data? So the data that has been collected from first hand of experience should be known as a primary one, and it has more reliable, authentic, and not being published anywhere, right? So the data, whatever we collected, that should be come from the first hand of experience itself. So that kind of data will be treated as the primary data. So the data what we collected that should be more reliable one and authentic and not published anywhere. So that kind of thing data will be treated as the primary data. And the primary data has not been changed or altered by human being, so therefore its validity should be greater than the secondary data, or not altered by the human being, so therefore its validity should be greater than the secondary data. So, what are the various methods that are available for collecting the primary data? So, for that, what we have to do is we have different methods like direct personal investigation and then indirect personal investigation or indirect oral investigation, and indirect investigation through local reporter questionnaires, and investigation through mail questionnaires, and investigation through observation. So these are the some of the common methods that are available for collecting the primary data, right? So first thing is the direct personal investigation. That means example is that interview method. So interview is the method where you can able to directly answer questions to other one to get the data. And second thing is that indirect oral investigation. So assigning some enumerators in between the persons and then entry word, so we can extract the data, what we called as an indirect oral investigation of the data. And similarly, so what we can able to perform the investigation through local reporters questionnaire, so that thing should be treated it as a investigation through questionnaire data. And investigation through questionnaire should also be treated as one of the method where we can able to send the mails, and then the data what we can able to extract from the other sources through mails also can able to extract it. So that kind of detail also one of the method for collecting the primary data. And investigation through observation should also be performed here, so which can be done through this. And so, some what are the merits and demerits of this primary data here? So, when if I took the advantages of the primary data, so the targeted issue are going to be addressed here properly, and the data interpretation is going to be better, and high accuracy of the data should the data what we get through primary should also have, and it should also be addressed some specific research issues, which can also be one of the advantage, and greater control will also be the one of the method for primary data. And if I took this demerits of this primary data, so the data what we collected, so should that the cost may be also be incurred uh, in order to perform or in order to get the primary data, and the time consuming also very more here, and more number of resources also going to be required, and inaccurate feedback is nothing should also be treated as a disadvantage of this method, and require a lot of skills with the labor, right? So the minutes what we have, the targeted issue are going to be addressed clearly. So that is the advantage, and data interpretation is better, and high accuracy of the data, and it should also address specific research issues and greater control. And the demerits is that evaluated, and it should be a time consuming process, and you should also have more number of resources are required, and inaccurate feedback, and require a lot of skills with the labor. Then comes to the secondary data. The secondary data is the data that has been already collected by the others, and these are usually in being in journals or periodicals and research publication official record. And the secondary data may be available in the published or in the form of unpublished form. So when it is not possible to collect the data by the primary method, an investigator can go to the secondary method. So the data that is collected from some purpose other than the problem at hand should be treated as the primary or secondary data. So the secondary data, so it means that the data should be already collected one, which is going to be extracted from the various sources like journals, books, libraries, periodical research publication, official records. So this secondary data may be available in the form of published one or in the form of unpublished one. So whenever it is not possible to collect such data by primary method, so the investigator can go for the secondary method. So the data collected from other sources will be treated as the secondary data. So what are the methods that are available for collecting the secondary data? So for that we have two types of sources like published sources and unpublished sources. So the published sources means we are able to get from international agencies or international institutions or international bodies like this, and we can also get the data from the government, and we can also get the data from municipal corporation on institutional or commercial purposes. So this and all will be treated as a published sources, and unpublished, what is the data what we collected through unpublished one should be treated as the primary one. So that's why, so the data what we gather from published sources will be treated as international or government, municipal, and the institutional or commercial purpose. So, what are the merits and demerits of the secondary data? So, the merits and demerits of the secondary data will be it should be a quick and cheap low source of the data, and wider geographical area is the best advantage of this method, and longer orientation period and needing to find the primary data. So the merits will be the quick and cheap source of the data and wider geographical area, longer orientation period, and able to find the primary data. When it comes to disadvantages, so no fulfill or specific research is not needed. That becomes the big advantage of this method, and pure accuracy, and the data is also not up to date, and then poor accessibility in some cases. So these are some of the disadvantages and advantages of the secondary data, right? So quick and cheap source of the data should be one of the advantage, and wider geographical area, and you can also be longer orientation period and then leading to find the primary data. So these are the advantages of this method, and demerits if I take this. So if pure accuracy and then no fulfill of specific research is needed, and data is also not up to date, and poor accessibility also in some of the cases, right? So these are the some of these disadvantages of this method. Let me explain the differences between the primary data and secondary data. So the primary data means real-time data, and secondary data is nothing but past data, and it should be sure about the sources of data, whereas the secondary data is not sure about the sources of data. So this primary data helps to give some results and findings, whereas this refining the problem is needed here, and it should be a costly and time consuming process, where it should be a cheap and no time consuming process, and it should also avoid some of the bias of the response data, whereas it can't know the data bias or not, and it should be more flexible and it should be less flexible, right? So these are the differences what can I make between the primary and the secondary. So primary means real-time data, and secondary data is nothing but past data, and it should be sure about the sources of data, but it is not sure about the sources of data, and the primary data I'm able to helps to give results in finding, whereas it should be refining the problem, and the primary data should be costly one and time consuming process, where it should be cheap and no consuming process, and primary data avoid the bias of response data and can't know in data bias one, and it should be more flexible and it should be less flexible. So these are the some of the tools and about the various sources of the primary and then secondary data. So here in this video I covered what are the various sources of data, like, and what are the factors to be considered for the data collection. So various sources of data will be external and internal sources. Again, these external sources will be treated as the primary and then secondary one. And these external and internal sources, we have some of the differences. So what is the data what we collected within the institution will be treated as internal one, and the data what we gather from external sources will be treated as the external source of the data. So what is the primary data means? The primary data is the data what we gathered from the first hand of information, and it should be reliable, authentic, and not published anywhere. It should be treated as the primary data here. And the primary data cannot be changed or altered by the human being, so it should be have the greater flexibility of the secondary data. And the methods what we have for collecting the data will be that the personal interview is the first one, where can able to conduct some of the interviews to gather the primary data, and indirect oral investigation is the thing which can be enabled through the enumerators, and investigation through the local reporters, right, through questionnaire should also be treated as the third method for collecting primary data, and investigation through mailed questionnaire should also be treated as the fourth method, and investigation through observation should also treated as the fifth method for collecting the data. So the merits and demerits of primary data. So the primary merits will be target issues are going to be reached, and then data interpretation is going to be better, and high accuracy of the data, and should also address the specific research issues and greater control, whereas the demerit should be evaluated cost, and then it should be time consuming, and it should have more number of resources are required, and inaccurate feedback, and required a lot of skills with the labor. So these are the some of the merits and demerits of the primary data. And secondary data, so secondary data is the thing where you can able to extract the data from other sources. That means already published one, like journals, periodicals, and then research publication and official record, like this. So the secondary data may be available in both in forms like published one and unpublished one. So we should be able to collect the data by primary method. So the published sources and unpublished sources are there. So the data what we collected from published sources will be treated as the secondary one, and the data what we gather unpublished one should be treated as the primary data here. So published sources like we can able to extract the data from international government, municipal corporation, and institutionals. And the secondary data merits and demerits will be it should be uh, merits will be that it should be quick and cheap source of the data and wider geographical area, longer orientation periods, and leading to find family data. So these are some of the advantages of the secondary data, whereas the disadvantage should be no fulfill of our specific research needs and pure accuracy, and data is not up to date and poor accessibility in some of the cases. So let me see the differences between this primary and secondary one. So in primary data, the data what we gather should be real-time one, and it should also be not sure about the sources of the data where the data is going to be get, and it should also be help to give the results and findings, and it should be a costly one, and it should be time-consuming process as well, and it should also avoid some of the bias or response data, and it should be more flexible one. Whereas when it comes to the secondary data, the data what we gathered is already existing. That's why what we call it as the past data, and it not sure about the sources of the data, and you can able to refine the problem as well, and then it should be cheap and no time consuming process, and cannot know data biasing or not, and less flexible. Thank you.
Like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.